The champagne glass slipped from my fingers the moment I heard Madison's voice cut through the din of the corporate holiday party like a blade through silk. I watched the crystal shatter against the marble floor of the Grandview Hotel ballroom, each shard catching the light from the chandeliers above, and I knew this moment would shatter something else entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh my God, is that really her? Madison's laugh was sharp enough to turn heads, and several did. Jessica, what are you even doing here? Did they hire you to clean up after the party too? The weight of 200 pairs of eyes settled on me like a physical thing. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as conversations died around us, replaced by the kind of electric anticipation that fills a room when someone's about to be publicly humiliated. Madison stood there in her designer cocktail dress, a vision in emerald green that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she tilted her head with that practiced expression of mock concern that had been perfected over years of sorority functions and country club gatherings. I looked down at my simple black dress, the one I'd carefully chosen from the clearance rack at Nordstrom Rack 3 months ago. It was elegant, in its simplicity, but standing next to Madison's couture creation, I felt like a shadow trying to compete with the sun. My hands, still slightly rough from years of actual work, smoothed the fabric nervously as I tried to find my voice. I was invited, I managed to say, though the words came out smaller than I intended. Around us, the party continued its measured rhythm, but I could sense the sideways glances, the whispered conversations beginning to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Madison's smile widened, and I recognized the expression from our childhood. It was the same look she'd worn when she'd convinced our parents that I was the one who had broken Mom's favorite vase, the same smile that had preceded years of being overlooked, underestimated, and quietly pushed aside. Invited? Jessica, sweetie, this is the Harrison and Associates annual party. It's for employees and their families. Are you here with someone? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I felt my throat tighten. How could I explain that I was here on my own merit? How could I make her understand that I belonged in this room just as much as she did, maybe more? The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having this conversation surrounded by the people who knew the truth, yet somehow the truth felt impossible to speak. She's probably working, chimed in Bradley, Madison's boyfriend of the month, a hedge fund manager whose personality was as flat as his carefully gelled hair. I heard they were hiring extra cleaning staff for tonight. Makes sense they'd want someone who knows the building. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly, but it was dismissive in a way that cut deeper than outright malice. These people didn't see me as a threat worth acknowledging with genuine cruelty. I was simply a curiosity, a momentary entertainment, someone so far beneath their notice that my presence here was more amusing than offensive. I had spent the last 3 years walking through the halls of Harrison and Associates in my janitor's uniform, pushing my cart from office to office, floor to floor, invisible to most of the people now staring at me with barely concealed pity. I had mopped their floors, emptied their trash cans, and listened to their conversations without them ever really seeing me. I had become a ghost in my own life, and the worst part was that it had been deliberate. Jessica's always been the practical one in our family, Madison continued, her voice carrying that patronizing tone that families use when they're proud of someone for having low expectations. While I was getting my MBA from Wharton, she was learning a trade. There's nothing wrong with honest work, right, Jess? The way she said honest work made it sound like charity, like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. How could I explain the complexity of the last 3 years? How could I tell her that every day I'd spent mopping those floors had been a choice, a carefully calculated decision that was about to pay off in ways she couldn't imagine? Actually, said a voice I didn't recognize, I think there might be some confusion here. The crowd parted slightly, and I saw a tall man in an expensive suit approaching us. He had silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from years of making decisions that matter. I didn't know who he was, but from the way conversations stopped when he moved through the room, it was clear he was someone important. Madison's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. I'm Madison Chen. I work in the Mergers and Acquisitions department. This is my sister, Jessica. She works here too, in maintenance." The man's eyebrows rose slightly, and I caught something in his expression that might have been amusement. "Maintenance," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word. "How interesting." I felt my pulse quicken. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more than he was letting on, and I had the sudden, terrifying thought that my carefully constructed facade was about to crumble in the most public way possible. "Yes," Madison continued, warming to her theme. "Jessica's always been very grounded. She never really had the grades for college, but she's found her place, haven't you, Jess? There's dignity in all kinds of work." The condescension in her voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I saw several people in the crowd exchange glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. I recognized faces from the office, people who passed me in the hallways every day without acknowledgement, people whose meetings I'd overheard while cleaning their conference rooms, people who had no idea that their casual dismissal had been noted and filed away for future reference. "The grades for college," the silver-haired man repeated. And now, I was certain he was struggling not to smile. "That's interesting. Jessica, isn't it? I don't think we've been properly introduced." He extended his hand to me, and I shook it, feeling the calluses on my palm that came from years of actual physical labor. "Jessica Chen," I said quietly. "Well, Jessica Chen," he said. "I have to say, this is fascinating. I've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time." Madison looked confused, and I saw her glance around the room as if seeking support. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. How do you know Jessica?" The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he was about to enjoy what came next. "Well, that's an interesting story." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You see, I'm Robert Harrison. I'm the founder of Harrison and Associates. The impact of his words rippled through the crowd like a physical wave. Madison's face went pale, and I saw her grip tighten on Bradley's arm. Around us, conversations stopped entirely, and the only sound was the gentle clinking of glasses and the soft jazz playing from the speakers hidden throughout the ballroom. "Mr. Harrison," Madison stammered. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry for any confusion. I was just explaining to my sister that she works here in maintenance, and I thought maybe there had been some mistake about the invitation." "Oh, there's no mistake," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden quiet. "Jessica was definitely supposed to be here tonight. In fact, I specifically requested that she attend. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for 3 long years. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, every humiliation I'd endured was about to either justify itself or destroy me completely. "You requested?" Madison's voice had gone up an octave, and I could see her mind racing, trying to process information that didn't fit into her carefully constructed worldview. "Absolutely," Mr. Harrison said. "You see, Jessica and I have been working together quite closely for the past year. She's been instrumental in several of our most important initiatives." The lie was so smoothly delivered that even I almost believed it for a moment. But I knew what was coming next, and the knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone. This was the moment of truth, the moment when 3 years of careful planning would either vindicate me or destroy everything I'd built. Madison's laugh was brittle, forced, Working together? Mr. Harrison, I think there might be some confusion. Jessica cleans the offices. She's not involved in any business initiatives. Cleans the offices? Mr. Harrison repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose she does do that, among other things. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama, and I felt like I was standing in the center of a rapidly tightening circle. Faces surrounded me, some curious, some uncomfortable, some clearly enjoying the spectacle. I recognized Karen from accounting, who'd never once acknowledged my presence despite the fact that I'd been cleaning her office 3 times a week for 3 years. There was David from marketing, who'd once left a mess in the break room and then complained loudly about the lazy cleaning staff when it wasn't immediately cleaned up. And there was Jennifer from Human Resources, who'd processed my employment paperwork and who knew exactly who I was and what I did. Other things? Madison pressed, and I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. She was beginning to sense that something was wrong, that the narrative she'd constructed was missing crucial information. Mr. Harrison looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been respect, or possibly pity. Jessica, would you like to explain, or should I? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was my choice. I could continue to hide, continue to let people underestimate me, continue to play the role of the invisible janitor. Or I could step into the light and claim the identity I'd been building in secret for 3 years. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed late in the office, not just to clean but to learn. I thought about the conversations I'd overheard, the patterns I'd noticed, the opportunities I'd identified while moving invisibly through the corporate ecosystem. I thought about the reports I'd been writing, the analyses I'd been conducting, the recommendations I'd been making through carefully anonymous channels. I thought about my father, who died when I was 15, leaving behind a small janitorial business, and a daughter who'd inherited his work ethic, but not his limited ambitions. I thought about my mother, who'd remarried and created a new family that didn't quite have room for the daughter who reminded her of her first husband. I thought about Madison, who'd been the golden child from the moment she'd entered our reconstituted family, effortlessly claiming the attention and resources that had once been mine. And I thought about the plan I'd been executing for 3 years, the plan that had required me to become invisible, to be dismissed and overlooked, to gather information and build relationships from the shadows while everyone assumed I was just the help. I think, I said quietly, that I can explain. The room fell completely silent. Even the jazz music seemed to fade into the background as every person in the ballroom leaned forward to hear what the janitor had to say. 3 years ago, I began, my voice growing stronger with each word, I started working at Harrison & Associates as a member of the cleaning staff. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to pay the bills while I figured out my next move. I'd graduated from Berkeley with a degree in business administration, but the job market was tough, and I needed work. I saw Madison's mouth fall open, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction. She'd been so busy constructing her narrative of my failure that she'd never bothered to ask about my actual qualifications. Berkeley? Madison whispered. But you never said. Mom always said you barely finished high school. Mom said, a lot of things, I replied, not taking my eyes off her face. But she was wrong about that. I graduated summa cum laude, actually. I just never saw the point in correcting her assumptions. The crowd murmured, and I saw people exchanging glances. This wasn't the story they'd expected, and I could see them recalibrating, trying to figure out how the pieces fit together. Anyway, I continued, I took the job with the cleaning crew because I needed the income, but I quickly realized it offered something else: access. As a janitor, I was invisible. I could move through the building without anyone questioning my presence. I could be in conference rooms when sensitive meetings were happening. I could see documents that were left on desks. I could observe the daily operations of the company from a perspective that nobody else had. Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly, She's being modest. What Jessica discovered was that there were significant inefficiencies in our operations that were costing us millions of dollars annually. Problems that were invisible to management but obvious to someone who moved through every department every day. Inefficiencies? Bradley asked, his voice skeptical. What kind of inefficiencies could a janitor possibly identify? I smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it was a smile that came from a place of confidence rather than careful restraint. Well, for starters, the patent infringement case that the legal department has been working on for 18 months, the one that's cost us over $3 million in legal fees? I identified the prior art that invalidates the plaintiff's claims 6 months ago. The research was sitting in Dr. Martinez's recycling bin in the R&D department. The room erupted in whispers, and I saw Jennifer from HR pull out her phone, presumably to verify what I was saying. Then there's the supply chain issue that's been causing delays in the manufacturing division. Your purchasing department has been buying components from 3 different suppliers when they could source everything from one vendor for 30% less. I noticed it because I was emptying the trash in procurement every Tuesday and Thursday, and I kept seeing the same purchase orders being rejected and resubmitted. That's impossible, someone called out from the back of the crowd. Those kinds of patterns would be obvious to the purchasing team. Would they? I asked. When you're working on individual orders, focused on your specific responsibilities, it's easy to miss the bigger picture. But when you're moving through the building every day, seeing the same documents being thrown away repeatedly, patterns become obvious. Mr. Harrison stepped forward. What Jessica is too modest to mention is that she didn't just identify these problems, she provided solutions. Detailed analyses, cost projections, implementation strategies. She's been submitting reports through our anonymous suggestion system for over a year, and frankly, they've been some of the most insightful recommendations we've received. Madison looked like she'd been slapped. Reports? What reports? Jessica, you never mentioned anything about reports. Why would I? I asked, genuinely curious. When was the last time you asked me about my work? About anything in my life that wasn't directly related to how it reflected on you? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I saw Madison's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that might have been shame. Around us, the crowd had grown larger, and I realized that people were pulling out their phones, recording what was happening. This moment was going to live forever on social media, and I felt a brief flash of panic at the thought. But then, I looked at Mr. Harrison, who was watching me with something that looked like pride, and I realized that I'd reached the point of no return. There was no going back to invisibility, no returning to the safety of being dismissed and overlooked. I'd stepped into the light, and now I had to see it through. The truth is, I continued, addressing the crowd as much as Madison, I've been living a double life for 3 years. By day, I was Jessica the janitor, invisible and ignored. But by night, I was studying your business, learning your systems, identifying opportunities for improvement. I've been writing reports, conducting analyses, and developing strategies that have saved this company millions of dollars. Millions. Madison's voice was faint. The patent case alone would have cost us $8 million if we'd lost, Mr. Harrison confirmed. Jessica's research saved us that entire expense. The supply chain recommendations she made have reduced our manufacturing costs by 12%. Her analysis of our customer retention data led to a marketing strategy that increased our renewal rates by 15%. I watched the information sink in, watched Madison's worldview crumble in real time. This was the sister she'd dismissed, the family member she'd pitied, the person she'd used as a cautionary tale about the importance of ambition and education. And now she was learning that I'd been more successful than she'd ever imagined, just in a way she'd never thought to look for. But why? She asked, and for the first time her voice held genuine confusion rather than condescension. Why didn't you just apply for a regular position? Why the charade? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months. The answer was complicated, rooted in years of family dynamics and personal choices that were difficult to explain to a room full of strangers. Because, I said slowly, I learned a long time ago that being underestimated is a superpower. When people don't see you as a threat, they don't guard their secrets. When they don't think you're listening, they say things they probably shouldn't. When they assume you're not smart enough to understand what's happening, they give you access to information that they'd never share with a competitor. I paused, looking around the room at the faces staring back at me. Some looked impressed, others confused, and a few seemed genuinely angry, as if I'd somehow cheated by not conforming to their expectations. For 3 years, I've been invisible in this company. I've heard conversations about mergers and acquisitions, about personnel decisions, about strategic planning. I've seen documents that were supposed to be confidential, observed meetings that were supposed to be private, and I've used all of that information to understand this business better than most of the people who work here in traditional roles. That's corporate espionage, Bradley said, his voice uncertain. Mr. Harrison laughed. It's business intelligence, and it's perfectly legal. Jessica never violated any confidentiality agreements because she never had access to officially confidential information. She just paid attention to what was happening around her and drew intelligent conclusions from publicly available data. Plus, I added, everything I learned I used to benefit the company. I wasn't selling secrets to competitors or using insider information for personal gain. I was identifying problems and proposing solutions. Madison shook her head slowly. I don't understand. If you were so successful, why didn't you just tell us? Why let us think you were just a janitor? The question cut to the heart of everything, and I felt the weight of 3 years of accumulated resentment pressing down on me. How could I explain that I'd tried to share my successes with my family, only to be dismissed or ignored? How could I make her understand that her reaction tonight was exactly why I'd learned to keep my achievements to myself? Because every time I tried to tell you about anything important in my life, you either changed the subject or found a way to make it about yourself. I said quietly, when I graduated from college, you were planning your engagement party. When I got my first job, you were starting your MBA program. When I won the Morrison Award for Academic Excellence, you were dealing with your breakup with what's-his-name. There was never room in your life for my success. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I saw Madison's face go through a series of emotions. Around us, the crowd had grown even larger, and I realized that this conversation had become a public spectacle. People were openly recording now, and I knew that by tomorrow morning this entire scene would be all over social media. The Morrison Award? Madison's voice was barely a whisper. Jessica, that's one of the most prestigious academic honors in the country. I know, I said simply. I won it my senior year. I called to tell you, but you were busy with something else. You said we'd talk later, but we never did. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Madison processing the information, trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the person standing in front of her. Around us, the crowd was beginning to murmur, and I caught fragments of conversations as people tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. I had no idea, Madison said finally. Jessica, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask, I replied. Not unkindly, but not gently either. You constructed a narrative about who I was and what I was capable of, and then you never questioned it. It was easier to believe that I was the failure in the family than to consider that maybe I was succeeding in ways you couldn't see. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. I think we've given our guests enough entertainment for one evening. I looked around the room at the sea of faces staring back at me, and I realized that he was right. This had gone far enough. Whatever happened next, it didn't need to be a public spectacle. "Actually," I said, "I think I've said what I needed to say. Madison, we can talk later if you want. But right now, I think I'd like to get some air." I started to move toward the exit, but Mr. Harrison's voice stopped me. "Jessica, wait." I turned back, and he was smiling in a way that made my pulse quicken. There was something in his expression that suggested the evening wasn't over yet. "There's one more thing I think everyone should know," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Jessica's contributions to this company haven't gone unnoticed. In fact, the board of directors has been discussing her future with us for several weeks now." My heart stopped. This wasn't part of the plan. I'd expected to be revealed, maybe even praised, but I hadn't expected this. "What kind of future?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Mr. Harrison's smile widened. "Well, that's what I was hoping to discuss with you tonight. You see, we've been looking for someone to head up our new strategic analysis department. Someone with your particular combination of insight, discretion, and analytical ability. Someone who understands this business from the ground up." The room erupted in whispers, and I felt my knees go weak. A department head position at Harrison & Associates was the kind of opportunity that people with decades of experience competed for. It was the kind of job that came with a corner office, a six-figure salary, and the respect that I'd been craving my entire professional life. "Head of Strategic Analysis?" I repeated, not quite believing what I was hearing. "The position comes with a substantial salary increase, of course," Mr. Harrison continued, "along with stock options, a full benefits package, and the authority to build your own team. You'd be reporting directly to the executive committee." I felt dizzy. This was beyond my wildest dreams, beyond anything I'd dared to hope for when I'd started this journey 3 years ago. I'd wanted respect, recognition, and the chance to prove myself. I'd never imagined that it would lead to something like this. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "Say yes," called out someone from the crowd, and I heard scattered laughter and applause. I looked at Madison, who was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. There was shock there, certainly, but also something else. Something that might have been pride or possibly envy, or maybe just the slow dawning realization that everything she thought she knew about her sister had been wrong. I started, then stopped. This was too much, too fast. An hour ago, I'd been the invisible janitor, content to remain in the shadows. Now I was being offered a position that would put me at the center of everything, that would make me visible in a way that I wasn't sure I was ready for. "You don't have to answer tonight," Mr. Harrison said kindly. "Take some time to think about it. But Jessica, I want you to know that you've earned this. Your work speaks for itself." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Around us." The crowd was beginning to disperse, conversations resuming as people processed what they'd witnessed. The drama was over, but the implications were just beginning to sink in. Madison approached me slowly, her expression uncertain. "Jessica, I don't know what to say. I had no idea about any of this." "I know," I said quietly. "That was kind of the point." She flinched at the gentle rebuke, and I felt a stab of sympathy for her. This couldn't be easy, learning that the sister she'd dismissed was actually more successful than she was. It challenged everything she thought she knew about our family dynamics, about success, about the natural order of things. "I feel like I owe you an apology," she said. "Actually, I feel like I owe you a lot of apologies." "You don't owe me anything," I replied, and I meant it. "You just treated me the way I let you treat me. I could have corrected your assumptions at any time. I chose not to." "But why? Why let me think you were struggling? Why let me condescend to you?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months, and I still didn't have a complete answer. The truth was complicated, rooted in psychology and family dynamics that I was still trying to understand. Because, I said slowly, it was easier than competing with you. It was easier than risking failure. If I never told you I was trying to succeed, then I never had to deal with the possibility that I might not measure up to your expectations. Madison stared at me for a long moment, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. You were protecting yourself. I was protecting myself, I confirmed, but I was also limiting myself. I was so afraid of being seen as a failure that I chose to be invisible instead. It took me 3 years to realize that being invisible is just another kind of failure. We stood there in silence for a moment, surrounded by the remnants of the party, the broken champagne glass still glittering on the floor at our feet. The sound of conversation and laughter continued around us, but it felt distant, like we were in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. What happens now? Madison asked finally. I looked around the room at the faces of people who would never see me the same way again, at the man who'd just offered me the opportunity of a lifetime, at the sister who was finally seeing me for who I really was. Now, I said, I figure out what comes next. And for the first time in 3 years, I had absolutely no idea what that would be. But for the first time in my life, I was excited to find out. The subway ride home felt like traveling through a different world entirely. I sat in the corner seat, still wearing my black dress from the party, watching the city blur past the windows, while my mind struggled to process everything that had happened. 3 hours ago, I'd been Jessica the janitor, invisible and dismissed. Now I was Jessica the strategic analyst, offered a corner office and a salary that would triple my current income. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Text messages from coworkers I'd never spoken to, friend requests on social media from people who'd ignored me for years, and missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Someone had posted a video of the confrontation at the party, and it was already spreading across platforms with captions like, "Janitor reveals she's actually a genius," and "Corporate Cinderella story goes viral." I turned the phone face down and pressed my forehead against the cool window, watching my reflection in the dark glass. The apartment I came home to was a studio in Queens, barely 600 square feet with a Murphy bed and a kitchen that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge. The contrast between this space and the luxury hotel ballroom where I'd just been offered an executive position was almost comical. I kicked off my heels and sat on the edge of my bed, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. For 3 years, this small space had been my sanctuary. It was where I'd written my reports, where I'd analyzed data late into the night, where I'd built the foundation for everything that happened tonight. The walls were covered with charts and graphs, printouts of financial data, and flowcharts mapping the internal structure of Harrison and Associates. To anyone else, it might have looked like the obsessive workspace of someone who'd lost touch with reality. To me, it was the command center of a carefully orchestrated plan. I pulled out my laptop and opened the encrypted folder where I kept my real work. The folder that contained 3 years of observations, analysis, and strategic recommendations that had apparently saved Harrison and Associates millions of dollars. Looking at it now, I felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. Had I really accomplished all of this while pretending to be just the cleaning lady? The first document in the folder was dated 3 years and 2 months ago, just a week after I'd started working at Harrison and Associates. It was a simple observation about waste management practices, written more out of curiosity than any serious analytical intent. The last document was dated yesterday, a comprehensive report on international market expansion opportunities that had taken me 2 months to research and write. The evolution from that first tentative observation to yesterday's sophisticated analysis told the story of my transformation from desperate job seeker to strategic business consultant. My phone rang, startling me out of my reverie. Madison's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Jessica?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "Are you okay?" You left so suddenly, and I wanted to make sure you were all right. I almost laughed. After 3 years of barely speaking to me, except to offer condescending advice about my life choices, now she was worried about my well-being. I'm fine, Madison. I just needed some time to think. About the job offer? About everything. I walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like distant stars. This wasn't how I expected tonight to go. Jessica, I have to ask, were you ever going to tell us? About the degree, about the reports, about any of it? The question cut deeper than I'd expected. Was I going to tell them? I'd convinced myself that I was protecting my work by keeping it secret, but if I was honest, I'd also been protecting myself from their judgment. What if they'd dismissed my achievements the same way they'd dismissed everything else about me? What if they'd found ways to minimize my success or explain it away? I don't know, I admitted. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but I think I was really just waiting to feel confident enough to handle your reaction. Our reaction? Madison's voice was sharp with what might have been hurt or defensiveness. What kind of reaction did you expect? I closed my eyes, remembering years of family dinners where my accomplishments were overlooked or overshadowed, years of being compared unfavorably to Madison's more traditional markers of success. Honestly, I expected exactly what happened tonight. I expected you to be shocked that I was capable of more than you thought, and then I expected you to find reasons why it didn't really count. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Madison finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Is that really what you think of us? Of me? Madison, when I called to tell you about winning the Morrison Award, you said, "That's nice," and immediately started talking about your internship interview. When I got my first job out of college, you asked if it came with health insurance because you assumed it was entry-level retail. When I mentioned that I was thinking about graduate school, you laughed and said I should focus on getting my life together first. Each memory came back with crystal clarity, sharp-edged and painful. What was I supposed to think? I didn't realize. She started, then stopped. God, Jessica, I'm so sorry. I didn't know I was doing that. That's the problem, I said quietly. You didn't know because you weren't paying attention. You were so focused on your own success that you never bothered to notice mine. Another long silence. I could hear traffic in the background and realized she was probably still at the hotel, maybe standing outside on the sidewalk having this conversation while the party continued inside. What can I do? She asked finally. How do I fix this? It was such a Madison question, so characteristic of her approach to problems. Identify the issue, develop a solution, implement it efficiently. But some things couldn't be fixed with the same kind of strategic thinking that worked in the corporate world. I don't know if you can fix it, I said honestly. This isn't something that happened overnight, and it's not something that can be resolved with an apology. This is 3 years of me feeling invisible in my own family. 3 years of letting you believe I was failing because it was easier than risking your judgment. But you weren't failing. You were succeeding beyond anything I could have imagined. I was succeeding in secret, I corrected, which is its own kind of failure. I was so afraid of not being good enough that I chose to be nobody at all. I heard her take a shaky breath. What happens now? With us, I mean. It was the same question she'd asked at the party, and I still didn't have a good answer. The revelation of my hidden success had changed the dynamic between us fundamentally. I was no longer the struggling younger sister who needed her guidance and pity. She was no longer the undisputed star of the family. We were going to have to figure out how to relate to each other as equals, and I wasn't sure either of us knew how to do that. I don't know, I said. Maybe we start over. Maybe we try to get to know each other as adults instead of as the people we were when we were kids. I'd like that, she said softly, if you're willing to try. After we hung up, I sat in my small apartment and tried to process the strangeness of the evening. In the span of a few hours, I'd gone from being invisible to being viral, from being dismissed to being offered an executive position, from being pitied by my sister to being, what? Respected? Feared? I wasn't sure yet. My laptop chimed with an email notification, and I saw Mr. Harrison's name in my inbox. The subject line read, "Formal offer, Strategic Analysis Department." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The email was brief and professional, outlining the terms of the position he'd mentioned at the party. The salary was even higher than I'd imagined, and the benefits package was comprehensive. There was also an attachment labeled Department Charter, which outlined the scope and responsibilities of the new strategic analysis team I'd be building. Reading through the charter, I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with terror. This wasn't just a promotion, it was an opportunity to fundamentally change how Harrison and Associates approached business intelligence and strategic planning. I'd have the authority to hire my own team, access to data from every department, and the mandate to identify opportunities for improvement across the entire organization. It was everything I'd dreamed of, and more than I'd dared to hope for. It was also completely terrifying. I spent the next hour researching the company's organizational structure, trying to understand where this new department would fit and how it would interact with existing teams. The more I learned, the more I realized that this position was going to put me at the center of some very complex political dynamics. There were people at Harrison and Associates who'd been competing for executive positions for years, and I was being offered one after working there for 3 years as a janitor. That wasn't going to go over well with everyone. My phone buzzed, with a text from my mother. "Madison told me about tonight. Call me when you have a chance. We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. My relationship with my mother was even more complicated than my relationship with Madison, and I needed time to figure out how to navigate these new dynamics before I opened that particular can of worms. Instead, I opened my laptop and started working on a response to Mr. Harrison's email. I wanted to accept the position, but I also wanted to understand exactly what I was getting myself into. I drafted a message requesting a meeting to discuss the details, including the timeline for the transition, the process for building my team, and the expectations for my first 90 days in the role. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about the 3 years I'd spent in preparation for this moment, even though I hadn't known this moment was coming. Every report I'd written, every analysis I'd conducted, every insight I'd developed had been building toward something, but I'd never been sure what that something would be. Now I knew. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 3 years making myself invisible in order to become visible. I'd chosen to be underestimated so that I could gather the information and develop the skills I needed to prove my worth. It had been a long game, played with patience and strategy, and it had paid off in ways I never could have predicted. But success always comes with a price, and I was beginning to understand what that price would be. I'd spent 3 years in the shadows, and now I was being thrust into the spotlight. I'd spent 3 years being dismissed and ignored, and now I was going to be scrutinized and judged. I'd spent 3 years hiding my capabilities, and now I was going to have to prove them every single day. I finished my email to Mr. Harrison and sent it before I could second-guess myself. Then I closed my laptop and looked around my small apartment, wondering how much longer I'd be living here. The salary increase would allow me to move somewhere bigger, somewhere that better reflected my new status. But part of me was reluctant to leave this space that had been my cocoon for the past 3 years. My phone rang again, and this time, it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Jessica Chen?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes?" "This is Sarah Martinez from Business Insider. I'm calling about the video from tonight's Harrison and Associates party. I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing an interview about your story. I hung up immediately and turned off my phone. The last thing I needed was media attention complicating an already complex situation. But as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I realized that the media attention was probably just the beginning. My story had already gone viral, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. I walked to my bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I was still wearing the black dress from the party, but my carefully applied makeup was smudged, and my hair was disheveled. I looked like someone who'd been through an ordeal, which I supposed I had. But there was something else in my reflection, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I looked like someone who was ready for whatever came next. I changed into pajamas and made myself a cup of tea, then sat at my small table with a legal pad and started making lists. If I was going to accept this position, I needed to be strategic about it. I needed to understand the challenges I'd be facing, the allies I'd need to cultivate, and the potential obstacles I'd encounter. The first challenge would be credibility. Despite Mr. Harrison's public endorsement, there would be people at the company who questioned whether I was qualified for such a senior position. I'd need to prove myself quickly and decisively, and I'd need to do it while navigating the complex politics of an organization where I'd been invisible for 3 years. The second challenge would be team building. I'd need to hire analysts, researchers, and project managers who could help me execute the vision for the strategic analysis department. But I'd be competing with other departments for top talent, and I'd be doing it without an established reputation or network. The third challenge would be delivering results. Mr. Harrison had offered me this position based on the quality of my anonymous reports, but now I'd need to produce that same level of insight and analysis under my own name, with the pressure and scrutiny that came with an executive role. As I made my lists, I found myself getting excited about the challenges ahead. For 3 years, I'd been working in isolation, analyzing problems and developing solutions without the resources or authority to implement them. Now I'd have both the resources and the authority, and I'd be able to see my ideas translated into action. But first, I needed to survive the transition from invisible to visible, from dismissed to respected, from Jessica the janitor to Jessica the strategic analyst. And that was going to require all the skills I'd developed over the past 3 years, plus some new ones I'd need to learn quickly. I was still making lists when the sun came up, painting my small apartment in golden light. I'd been awake all night, but I didn't feel tired. I felt energized, focused, and ready for whatever came next. My phone, which I'd turned back on an hour earlier, showed dozens of missed calls and text messages. Some were from reporters, some were from coworkers, and a few were from family members who'd apparently heard about the party from Madison. I ignored most of them, but I did read a text from my old college roommate, Amy. Saw the video. Can't believe you've been holding out on us for 3 years. Call me when you get a chance. So proud of you. Amy's message made me smile. She was one of the few people who'd known about my academic achievements in college, and she'd always believed I was capable of more than my family gave me credit for. It would be nice to have someone to talk to who understood both where I'd come from and where I was going. I was about to call her when my laptop chimed with another email. This one was from Mr. Harrison's assistant, requesting a meeting for later that morning to discuss the details of my new position. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, which gave me just enough time to shower, change, and mentally prepare for what would probably be the most important conversation of my professional life. As I got ready, I thought about the woman I'd been 12 hours earlier. She'd been careful, cautious, invisible. She'd been playing defense, protecting herself from judgment and disappointment. She'd been successful in secret, accomplished in hiding, brilliant in the shadows. The woman looking back at me in the mirror now was different. She was still careful and cautious, but she was no longer invisible. She was ready to play offense, to take risks, to step into the light and claim the recognition she'd earned. She was ready to be brilliant in public. I put on my best suit, a navy blue outfit I'd bought for job interviews 3 years ago but had never worn. It still fit perfectly, and it made me look professional, competent, authoritative. It made me look like someone who belonged in a corner office. The subway ride to Manhattan felt different this morning. Instead of heading to the service entrance where the cleaning staff entered the building, I was going to walk through the front doors like any other executive. Instead of changing into a uniform in the basement locker room, I was already dressed for the meeting that would determine my future. As the train pulled into my station, I took a deep breath and prepared to step into my new life. 3 years of preparation had led to this moment, and I was ready to make the most of it. The Harrison & Associates building looked the same as always, a gleaming tower of glass and steel reaching toward the sky. But everything felt different as I approached the front entrance. The security guard who'd seen me come and go for 3 years did a double take when he saw me in a suit instead of a uniform. "Ms. Chen?" he said uncertainly. "I heard about last night. Congratulations." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, using his name for the first time even though I'd seen his nameplate every day for 3 years. "It's been quite a journey." He smiled and handed me a visitor's badge. "Mr. Harrison's office is on the 40th floor. Elevators are to your right." I took the badge and headed for the elevators, feeling surreal about needing a visitor's pass to enter a building where I'd worked for 3 years. But I supposed that made sense. Jessica, the janitor, had belonged in the service areas and back, hallways. Jessica, the strategic analyst, belonged in the executive suites. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like ascending to another world. I'd cleaned offices on every floor of this building, but I'd never been above the 35th floor. The executive levels were different, quieter, more luxurious. The carpet was thicker, the artwork more expensive, the atmosphere more rarefied. Mr. Harrison's assistant, an elegant woman in her 50s, greeted me with professional warmth. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Harrison is expecting you. Can I get you coffee or water?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." She led me to a conference room adjacent to Mr. Harrison's office, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the city. I'd never seen Manhattan from this height during the day, and the vista was breathtaking. Mr. Harrison entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick folder and wearing the same confident smile he'd worn at the party. "Jessica, thank you for coming in. I hope you had a chance to review the offer." "I did, and I have some questions." "Of course. Please, sit down and let's talk through everything." For the next 2 hours, we discussed every aspect of the position in detail: the scope of the department, the reporting structure, the budget for hiring and operations, the timeline for implementation, and the metrics by which my success would be measured. Mr. Harrison answered every question thoughtfully and thoroughly, and I began to understand that this wasn't just a generous gesture or a publicity stunt. He was serious about creating this department, and he was serious about my role in leading. "Do I have to ask?" I said as our meeting was winding down. "Why me?" "I mean, I'm grateful for the opportunity, but there must be other people with more traditional qualifications who could do this job." Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair and considered the question carefully. "There are certainly people with more traditional qualifications," he agreed. "But traditional qualifications would give me traditional results. What you've shown over the past year is the ability to see patterns and opportunities that others miss. That's not something you can teach, and it's not something you can hire based on a resume." He opened the folder he'd brought into the meeting and pulled out a stack of reports. I recognized them immediately as the anonymous submissions I'd been making through the company's suggestion system. "These reports," he continued, "represent some of the most insightful business analysis we've ever received. They're well-researched, clearly written, and they've consistently identified problems and opportunities that our traditional analysts missed. When we traced them back to their source and realized they were coming from someone on the cleaning staff, it raised a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" Questions about how we evaluate talent, how we recognize potential, and how many brilliant people we might be overlooking because they don't fit our traditional hiring patterns. He gestured toward the stack of reports. These proved that intelligence and insight can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the best perspective is the one that comes from outside the established hierarchy. I felt a flush of pride at his words, but also a nagging worry about the expectations this created. What if I can't live up to those reports? What if the quality of my work declines when I'm no longer working in secret? Mr. Harrison smiled. That's a valid concern, and it's one of the reasons I want to set clear expectations from the beginning. I'm not expecting you to single-handedly revolutionize our business intelligence capabilities overnight. I'm expecting you to build a team and develop processes that can consistently deliver the kind of insights you've been providing individually. And if I fail, then we'll figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. But Jessica, based on everything I've seen, I don't think failure is likely. You've already proven you can do this work at the highest level. Now you just need to learn how to do it as part of a team and within a formal organizational structure. By the time I left the meeting, I had a clear understanding of what I was stepping into and what would be expected of me. I also had a start date, 3 weeks away, which would give me time to finish my transition out of the cleaning staff and prepare for my new role. As I walked through the lobby on my way out, I passed several people I recognized from the night before. Some nodded and smiled, others pretended not to see me, and a few stared openly as if I were some kind of exotic specimen. I realized this was going to be part of my new reality, the constant awareness that people were watching me, judging me, waiting to see if I could live up to the hype. The subway ride home gave me time to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I'd been planning to spend the weekend writing another anonymous report about supply chain inefficiencies. Today, I was planning to build a department that could address those inefficiencies systematically and permanently. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt inevitable. 3 years of careful preparation had led to this moment, and now I needed to prepare for the next phase of my journey. I was no longer the invisible woman gathering intelligence from the shadows. I was the strategic analyst who'd been tasked with translating that intelligence into action. When I got home, I found a package waiting outside my apartment door. Inside was a bottle of champagne and a card from Amy. For the woman who's been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, congratulations on your victory. I laughed at her choice of metaphor, but it was more accurate than she probably realized. I had been playing a long game, making moves that didn't make sense until the end strategy became clear. Now I'd achieved checkmate, but the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. I opened the champagne and poured myself a glass, then sat at my small table and started planning for the next 3 weeks. I had transitions to manage, relationships to rebuild, and a new identity to construct. Jessica the janitor was disappearing, and Jessica the strategic analyst was being born. It was going to be the most challenging 3 weeks of my life, but I was ready for the challenge. I'd spent 3 years learning how to be invisible. Now I was going to learn how to be extraordinary. My first day as head of strategic analysis started with a security badge malfunction. I stood in the marble lobby of Harrison & Associates at 7:30 in the morning, wearing my new charcoal gray suit and holding an access card that beeped angrily every time I tried to scan it. The security guard, a different man than Marcus who usually worked the morning shift, looked at me with barely concealed suspicion. "Ma'am, this badge shows you as cleaning staff," he said, squinting at his computer screen. "But you're dressed? Like..." He gestured vaguely at my professional attire, clearly confused by the disconnect between what his system was telling him and what he was seeing. "There was a recent promotion," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in my chest. "I should be updated as an executive-level employee now." He frowned and typed something into his computer, then shook his head. "I'm not seeing any updates in the system. Do you have documentation of the promotion? I pulled out my phone and showed him the email chain with Mr. Harrison's assistant, but he barely glanced at it. I can't authorize executive access based on emails. You'll need to contact HR and get your status updated before you can access the upper floors. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. 3 weeks ago, I could have walked into this building without question, taken the service elevator to any floor, and accessed areas that most employees never saw. Now, with a corner office waiting for me on the 38th floor, I was stuck in the lobby because a computer system hadn't been updated. Is there someone you can call? I asked, glancing at my watch. I had a team meeting scheduled for 8:30, and I'd spent the weekend preparing for it. The idea of starting my first day with a bureaucratic delay felt like an omen I didn't want to interpret. The security guard sighed and picked up his phone. Let me call up to HR and see if someone can come down to verify your status. While I waited, I watched the stream of employees flowing through the lobby, scanning their badges effortlessly and disappearing into elevators. I recognized many of them from my years of cleaning their offices, but now they looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Some nodded politely, others whispered to their companions, and a few pretended not to notice me at all. Jessica? A familiar voice made me turn around. It was Karen Winters from the accounting department, one of the few people who'd always been kind to me during my time as a janitor. I heard about your promotion. Congratulations. That's incredible. Thank you, Karen. I'm just waiting for my badge to be updated so I can actually get to my office. She laughed. First day problems. Huh? Don't worry, HR will sort it out. I'm so excited for you. Everyone's talking about how brilliant those reports were that you've been writing. Her genuine enthusiasm warmed me, but it also highlighted one of the challenges I was already facing. My success was no longer a secret, and people had opinions about it. Some, like Karen, seemed genuinely happy for me. Others, I suspected, were less enthusiastic about the janitor who'd suddenly been elevated to the executive floor. The HR representative who eventually came down to resolve my badge issue was a young man named Derek, who seemed more interested in his coffee than in helping me. He updated my access privileges with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested he'd done this dozens of times before, but as he handed me the newly programmed badge, he made a comment that stuck with me. Strategic Analysis Department, he said, reading from his screen. Interesting. We've never had a department by that name before. I guess they're really shaking things up around here. There was something in his tone that suggested skepticism, maybe even resentment. It was subtle, but I'd spent 3 years learning to read the subtext in people's conversations, and I could tell that not everyone was thrilled about the changes my promotion represented. The elevator ride to the 38th floor gave me a few minutes to collect myself and prepare for what was waiting. According to my schedule, I had a team meeting with the 3 analysts who'd been assigned to my new department, followed by individual meetings with each of them, and then a lunch with Mr. Harrison to discuss the department's priorities for the first quarter. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway I'd never seen before, despite having worked in the building for 3 years. The executive floors had a different energy entirely, quieter and more serious than the bustling offices. Below, the carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps, and the artwork on the walls was museum quality rather than the generic corporate prints that decorated the lower floors. My office was at the end of the hall, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling. Windows offering views of both the river and the city center. The nameplate on the door read, Jessica Chen, Director of Strategic Analysis, and seeing my name in elegant gold lettering made the whole situation feel real in a way that signing contracts and reviewing organizational charts hadn't. Inside, the office was everything I'd dreamed of during my years of cleaning other people's workspaces. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by built-in bookshelves and a sitting area with leather chairs arranged around a glass coffee table. There was even a small refrigerator and coffee station, luxuries that seemed almost decadent after 3 years of eating lunch at a folding table in the basement break room. But what struck me most was the silence. After years of working surrounded by the constant hum of vacuum cleaners and the chatter of my fellow cleaning staff, the quiet of this executive office felt almost oppressive. I walked to the windows and looked out at the city, trying to absorb the reality that this space was mine, that I belonged here, that I'd earned the right to make decisions that would affect the entire company. A knock on my door interrupted my reflection. "Ms. Chen? I'm David Liu, one of the analysts assigned to your team." I turned to find a young man in his late 20s, impeccably dressed and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. His handshake was firm and his smile was professional, but I could see the questions in his eyes. He was clearly wondering what qualifications I had that he didn't, what experience had prepared me for a leadership role that he was probably hoping to achieve himself someday. "David, it's good to meet you. Please, come in and have a seat." Over the next few minutes, 2 more team members arrived. Sarah Martinez, a data analyst with a PhD in economics from Columbia, and Michael Thompson, a former management consultant who joined Harrison and Associates 6 months earlier. All 3 were accomplished professionals with impressive credentials, and all 3 were clearly wondering what they were doing reporting to someone who'd been a janitor a month ago. I'd spent considerable time preparing for this meeting, knowing that establishing credibility with my team would be crucial to the department's success. I'd prepared presentations outlining our mission, reviewed their backgrounds and previous work, and developed preliminary project assignments that would play to each person's strengths. But sitting across from them in my new office, I felt the weight of their skepticism like a physical presence. "I know this is an unusual situation," I began, deciding to address the elephant in the room directly. "You're probably wondering how someone with my background ended up in this position and whether I'm qualified to lead a team of analysts with your credentials." Sarah shifted in her chair, and I caught a quick exchange of glances between David and Michael. They were definitely wondering exactly that. The truth is, my path to this office has been unconventional, but it's given me a perspective on this company that I believe will be valuable to our work. For the past 3 years, I've been observing Harrison and Associates from a unique vantage point, identifying inefficiencies and opportunities that might not be visible from within the traditional corporate hierarchy. I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd prepared, displaying a chart that showed the company's organizational structure overlaid with data flows and communication patterns. What I discovered during my time in operational support is that there are significant gaps between what the executive team thinks is happening in the company and what's actually happening on the ground level. David leaned forward, studying the chart with obvious interest. "These data flows, how did you map them?" 3 years of observation, I replied simply. When you're moving through every department every day, when you're invisible to most employees, you see patterns that others miss. You overhear conversations that reveal the real challenges teams are facing. You see the documents that get thrown away because people don't think they're important. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed analysis of the supply chain inefficiencies I'd identified months earlier. This analysis led to a 12% reduction in manufacturing costs. But it was only possible because I had access to information from multiple departments that don't typically communicate with each other. Sarah's expression had shifted from skepticism to curiosity. "You're saying that your operational role gave you better business intelligence than our traditional analysis methods?" "In some cases, yes. Traditional business analysis relies on formal reports, scheduled meetings, and official communications. But a lot of important information never makes it into those formal channels. It exists in casual conversations, in discarded drafts, in the gap between what people say in meetings and what they actually think." Michael nodded slowly. "That's actually brilliant. We've been trying to get better insights into operational efficiency for months, but we keep running into the problem that people tell us what they think we want to hear instead of what's actually happening." "Exactly. And that's where I think our department can add unique value. We're not just going to analyze the official data. We're going to find ways to access the unofficial information, the real story behind the numbers. For the next hour, we discussed specific projects and methodologies, and I watched the dynamic in the room shift gradually. My team was beginning to see that my unconventional background might actually be an asset rather than a liability. They were starting to understand that the insights I'd developed over the past 3 years weren't just lucky observations, but the result of a systematic approach to gathering and analyzing information that complemented their more traditional analytical skills. By the time the meeting ended, I felt cautiously optimistic about our ability to work together effectively. David, Sarah, and Michael were clearly talented professionals, and once they understood my vision for the department, they seemed genuinely excited about the possibilities. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. Building credibility. With my immediate team was important, but I'd need to prove myself to the entire organization if I wanted to be truly successful in this role. My individual meetings with each team member revealed additional insights into the challenges I'd be facing. David was ambitious and eager to make his mark, but he was also concerned about how working for a former janitor might affect his career prospects. Sarah was intellectually curious and excited about the innovative approaches we might develop, but she was also methodical and wanted to see detailed plans before committing fully to any project. Michael was experienced and pragmatic, and he was primarily interested in delivering results that would justify the resources being invested in our department. Each conversation reinforced my understanding that success in this role would require more than just analytical skills. I'd need to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, manage competing priorities, and constantly prove that my unconventional background was a strength rather than a weakness. My lunch meeting with Mr. Harrison took place in the executive dining room, a space I'd cleaned countless times but never imagined I'd dine in. The room was elegant without being ostentatious, with large windows overlooking the city and artwork that suggested refined taste without corporate blandness. "How was your first morning?" Mr. Harrison asked as we reviewed the menu. "Educational," I replied honestly. "I'm learning that managing perceptions is going to be as important as managing projects." He nodded knowingly. "That's always true in executive roles, but it's especially true in your situation. You're going to face more scrutiny than most new directors because your promotion challenges some people's assumptions about how careers are supposed to progress." Any advice on how to handle that? Deliver results quickly and visibly. The always best way to silence skeptics is to prove them wrong with measurable success. He paused to sip his water. But also be patient with people who need time to adjust their thinking. Change is hard for everyone, and what you represent is a significant change in how we evaluate and develop talent. Over the course of our meal, Mr. Harrison outlined his expectations for the department's first quarter. He wanted us to complete a comprehensive analysis of the company's competitive position, identify 3 major opportunities for operational improvement, and develop a framework for ongoing strategic monitoring that could be scaled across multiple business units. "That's an ambitious timeline," I observed. "It is, but I have confidence in your abilities. And frankly, we need to demonstrate the value of this department quickly. There are board members who are skeptical about the investment, and there are other executives who think the resources would be better allocated to existing departments." The political realities of my situation were becoming clearer. I wasn't just responsible for building a successful department. I was responsible for justifying the decision to create the department in the first place. My success or failure would reflect not just on me, but on Mr. Harrison's judgment in promoting me. "Who are the skeptics I should be aware of?" I asked. Mr. Harrison hesitated for a moment, then seemed to decide that honesty would serve me better than diplomacy. "Patricia Williams in finance thinks we're duplicating functions that already exist in other departments. James Morrison in operations believes that strategic analysis should be handled by people with operational experience. And there are a few board members who think the whole situation is a publicity stunt designed to generate positive media coverage. I absorbed this information carefully. Patricia Williams had always been polite during my interactions with her, as a janitor, but she'd also been the type of person who clearly viewed the cleaning staff as invisible. James Morrison had been more openly dismissive, treating me like a servant rather than a service provider. Neither of them would be natural allies in my new role. What about support? Who can I count on as I'm building the department? Besides, me? Karen Winters in accounting has been very positive about your promotion. She's been telling people that you were always professional and insightful during your interactions with her team. Robert Chen in legal, no relation despite the shared last name, has expressed interest in collaborating on some regulatory analysis projects. And surprisingly, several of the junior staff members have reached out to express support for your promotion. This last piece of information was particularly interesting. I'd had more interactions with junior staff during my time as a janitor, and many of them had treated me with respect and kindness rather than dismissal. It made sense that they might be more supportive of my unconventional career path. As we finished lunch, Mr. Harrison gave me one final piece of advice. Remember that you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're representing the idea that talent can come from anywhere, and that companies benefit when they look beyond traditional credentials. There are a lot of people watching to see if this experiment succeeds or fails. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders as I returned to my office. I wasn't just trying to build a successful career. I was trying to prove a point about merit versus pedigree, about the value of diverse perspectives in corporate decision-making. The afternoon brought a series of introductory meetings with other department heads, and each conversation reinforced the complexity of the political landscape I was navigating. Some colleagues were genuinely welcoming and curious about my vision for the strategic analysis department. Others were politely skeptical, clearly waiting to see if I could deliver on the promises that my promotion implied, and a few were barely concealing their resentment at what they perceived as an undeserved elevation. Patricia Williams was particularly frosty during our meeting. She listened to my explanation of the department's mission with the kind of polite attention that clearly indicated she was waiting for me to finish so she could explain why my approach wouldn't work. "I'm sure you mean well, Jessica," she said, when I concluded my presentation, "but I'm concerned about overlap with existing analytical functions. We already have a perfectly capable business intelligence team, and I'm not convinced we need another layer of analysis." "I understand your concern," I replied carefully, "but our focus is going to be on identifying opportunities that fall between traditional departmental boundaries. The supply chain analysis that led to the 12% cost reduction, for example, required insights from operations, procurement, and logistics that weren't being coordinated through existing channels. One successful analysis doesn't necessarily justify an entire department," Patricia countered, "especially when the methodology you used relied on access to confidential information that may not be appropriate for ongoing operations." Her criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth. Some of my insights had come from observing documents and conversations that weren't officially available to me. But I'd been careful to use only information that was already accessible to multiple people within the organization, and I'd always focused on patterns rather than specific confidential details. "I appreciate your perspective," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up meeting once I've had a chance to develop more detailed protocols for information gathering and analysis. I'd welcome your input on how to ensure we're operating within appropriate boundaries." Patricia agreed to the follow-up meeting, but her tone suggested she expected our protocols to reveal the flaws in my approach rather than address her concerns. It was clear that winning her over would require more than good intentions and theoretical explanations. I'd need to demonstrate concrete value while scrupulously adhering to corporate policies and procedures. My meeting with James Morrison was even more challenging. He made no effort to hide his skepticism about my qualifications, and he questioned whether someone without operational experience could provide meaningful insights about operational efficiency. "I've been running operations for 15 years, he said bluntly. "I've got an MBA from Kellogg and I've managed teams of hundreds of people. What exactly do you think you can tell me about my business that I don't already know?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been preparing for since accepting the position. "You're absolutely right that you know your business better than I do," I acknowledged. "But sometimes fresh eyes can spot patterns that are invisible to people who are deeply embedded in day-to-day operations. My value isn't in knowing more than you do about operations. It's in seeing your operations from a different perspective." "What kind of perspective could a janitor possibly offer that would be useful to someone in my position?" The dismissive tone was familiar from my years of being overlooked and underestimated, but it hit differently now that I was sitting across from him as a peer rather than as someone he could safely ignore. I felt a flash of anger, but I channeled it into determination rather than defensiveness. "The perspective of someone who sees the gaps between what executives think is happening and what's actually happening on the operational level," I replied, evenly. "The perspective of someone who notices when processes that look efficient on paper are actually creating bottlenecks for the people trying to implement them. The perspective of someone who's observed your teams long enough to identify patterns that might not be visible from within the management hierarchy." James's expression suggested he remained unconvinced, but he agreed to give me access to operational data for a preliminary analysis. "I'll give you 30 days, he said. "If you can show me something I don't already know about my own operations, then maybe this department of yours has some value. But if you waste my time with insights I could have gotten from any junior analyst, then I'm going to recommend that your budget gets reallocated to departments that actually know what they're doing." 30 days. It wasn't much time to prove myself, but it was an opportunity, and I'd learned to make the most of opportunities regardless of how they were presented. The contrast between these challenging meetings and my more positive interactions with other colleagues highlighted the reality of my situation. I had allies and skeptics, supporters and detractors, and my success would depend on my ability to convert enough of the skeptics into supporters while delivering results that justified the confidence of people like Mr. Harrison. As the day progressed, I found myself thinking about the 3 years I'd spent preparing for this moment without knowing what I was preparing for. All those nights of writing reports, all those hours of analysis, all those careful observations had been building toward something, but I'd never imagined it would be this complex blend of opportunity and pressure. My final meeting of the day was with the IT department to discuss data access and analytical tools. This conversation was purely technical, focused on the systems and permissions I'd need to do my job effectively. But even here, I encountered subtle reminders of the unusual nature of my situation. "It's going to take a few days to set up your access," the IT manager explained. "Your employee record shows you as facilities staff, and we'll need to completely rebuild your system permissions to reflect your new role." "How long will that take?" "For a standard promotion, maybe a day or two. But you're jumping from basic access to executive-level permissions, which requires additional security clearances and approval from multiple department heads. I'd estimate a week, maybe longer if anyone raises questions about the authorization." Another week of bureaucratic delays felt frustrating, but I was beginning to understand that these procedural hurdles were part of a larger pattern. My promotion challenged established systems and assumptions, and those systems were pushing back through 1,000 small frictions and complications. By the time I left the office that evening, I was mentally exhausted in a way that 3 years of physical labor had never made me. The intellectual challenges of building a new department were significant, but the social and political challenges were proving to be even more complex. The subway ride home gave me time to process everything that had happened during my first day. I'd expected resistance and skepticism, but experiencing it firsthand was different from anticipating it theoretically. Every conversation had been a negotiation. Every interaction had carried subtext. And every decision had political implications that extended far beyond the immediate issue at hand. When I got back to my apartment, I found another package waiting for me. This one was from Madison, containing a bottle of wine and a note that read, "For your first day in the corner office. I'm proud of you, even if I don't completely understand how you got there. Call me when you have time to celebrate." The gesture was thoughtful, but it also reminded me of how my success was affecting my family relationships. Madison was trying to be supportive, but there was still an undertone of confusion and perhaps resentment about my achievements. My mother hadn't contacted me since the night of the party, and I wasn't sure whether that was because she needed time to process what had happened or because she disapproved of the attention my promotion had generated. I opened Madison's wine and poured myself a glass, then sat at my small table with my laptop and started reviewing the notes I'd taken during the day's meetings. If I was going to succeed in this role, I'd need to be strategic about every relationship, every project, and every decision. I'd need to build alliances while delivering results, establish credibility while navigating politics, and prove myself while learning how to manage a team. It was a complex challenge, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge I'd been preparing for during my 3 years of invisible observation and analysis. I'd learned to see patterns that others missed, to identify opportunities that others overlooked, and to develop solutions that others hadn't considered. Now I'd have the chance to apply those skills at the highest levels of the organization. As I worked late into the night, developing project plans and strategic frameworks, I felt the same focused energy that had sustained me through years of anonymous report writing. The difference was that now my work would have my name on it, and the results would be visible to everyone in the company. I was no longer the invisible woman gathering intelligence from the shadows. I was the strategic analyst tasked with translating that intelligence into action, and the success or failure of that translation would determine not just my own future, but the future of everyone who believed that talent could emerge from unexpected places. The game had changed, but I was ready to play at this new level. I'd spent 3 years learning the rules. Now, it was time to prove I could win. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where everything had begun, but this time I was presenting to the board of directors instead of watching my family's reaction to an inheritance reading. The room was packed with executives, department heads, and the same board members who'd initially questioned the wisdom of creating my department. The strategic analysis department has exceeded every performance metric established at its inception, I said, clicking through slides that showed concrete results rather than theoretical possibilities. We've identified cost savings totaling $42 million, streamlined 17 operational processes, and prevented 2 potential compliance violations that could have resulted in significant regulatory penalties. Patricia Williams sat in the front row, her expression unreadable. James Morrison was taking notes, something I never would have expected 6 months ago. Even the skeptical board members were leaning forward, studying the data with obvious interest. The methodology we've developed combines traditional analytical approaches with observational intelligence gathering, I continued. We've proven that valuable insights often exist in the spaces between departments, in informal communications, and in patterns that become visible only when you're looking across organizational boundaries rather than within them. Mr. Harrison caught my eye and nodded approvingly. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of 18-hour days, challenging projects, and constant pressure to prove that my unconventional promotion had been justified. There had been setbacks and failures along the way, moments when I'd questioned whether I was truly qualified for this level of responsibility. The turning point had come 3 months earlier, when my team identified a pattern of customer complaints that revealed a fundamental flaw in our product development process. The discovery had prevented a product launch that would have cost the company over $20 million and potentially damaged our reputation in a key market. Questions? I asked as I concluded my presentation. Patricia raised her hand first. Jessica, I have to admit I was skeptical about your department initially, but these results speak for themselves. I'm particularly impressed by the cross-departmental collaboration your team has facilitated. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from her, and I accepted it graciously. Thank you, Patricia. Your input during our protocol development was invaluable. James Morrison was next. I want to publicly acknowledge that you've taught me things about my own operations that I didn't know. Your perspective has been genuinely valuable, and I'm grateful for the collaboration. Coming from him, this was high praise indeed. Our working relationship had evolved from hostile skepticism to grudging respect to genuine partnership, as my analyses consistently revealed opportunities he hadn't recognized. The board approved an expanded budget for my department and authorized the hiring of additional analysts. More importantly, they endorsed the methodology we'd developed and recommended implementing similar approaches across other business units. As the meeting concluded, I felt a profound sense of vindication, not just for myself, but for the idea that talent could emerge from unexpected places and that companies benefited when they looked beyond traditional credentials. Madison was waiting for me in the lobby when I came downstairs. She'd started visiting my office occasionally, and our relationship had evolved into something more balanced and authentic than it had ever been during our childhood. "How did it go?" she asked. "Better than I dared to hope," I replied honestly. "They're expanding the department and implementing our methodology company-wide." She smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile without any undercurrent of competition or comparison. "I'm proud of you, Jessica. Really proud." We walked out of the building together, past the security desk where Marcus still worked the evening shift. He waved as we passed, and I waved back, remembering the 3 years when he'd been one of the few people who'd consistently acknowledged my presence. "Can I ask you something?" Madison said as we reached the sidewalk. "Do you ever regret the 3 years you spent as a janitor? Do you wish you'd taken a more traditional path to get here?" I considered the question carefully. Those 3 years had been difficult, marked by invisibility and underestimation, but they'd also been the foundation for everything I'd achieved since then. "No," I said finally. "Those 3 years taught me things I never could have learned in a traditional analytical role. They gave me access to information and perspectives that are invisible from within the management hierarchy. They taught me humility, patience, and the value of really listening to what people are saying when they think no one important is paying attention." We parted ways at the subway entrance, and I rode home thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been a desperate job seeker willing to take any work available. Tonight, I was the head of a department that was changing how one of the city's largest companies approached strategic planning. My apartment was still small, though I could afford something larger now. I'd chosen to stay because this space represented something important to me. It was where I'd written my first tentative observations about waste management practices, where I'd developed the analytical frameworks that had revolutionized our approach to business intelligence, where I'd learned to see opportunity in invisibility. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the same table where I'd spent countless nights writing anonymous reports. My laptop was open to an email from a headhunter offering me a position at a Fortune 500 company, triple my current salary, and a chance to build strategic analysis capabilities at an even larger organization. It was tempting, but I wasn't ready to leave Harrison & Associates yet. I had more to prove here, more systems to develop, more people to mentor who might be hiding their potential behind unconventional backgrounds. My phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Saw the press release about your department expansion. Chess master strikes again. Dinner this weekend to celebrate?" I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely, but I think I'm ready to try something more challenging than chess now." The truth was, I'd learned that the most interesting games weren't the ones where you knew all the rules from the beginning. They were the ones where you had to discover the rules as you played. where success required not just intelligence but creativity, patience, and the willingness to see possibilities that others missed. 3 years ago, I'd thought success meant being recognized for my achievements. Now I understood that real success meant creating opportunities for others to achieve recognition they'd earned but hadn't been given. It meant changing systems, rather than just succeeding within them. I closed my laptop and looked around my small apartment one more time. Tomorrow, I'd start working on proposals for expanding our methodology to other companies, for creating training programs that could help other organizations identify hidden talent, for building systems that valued insight over credentials. I was no longer the invisible woman gathering intelligence from the shadows, but I hadn't forgotten the lessons those shadows had taught me. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful position isn't at the center of attention, but at the edge of perception, where you can see things that others miss and understand patterns that others overlook. The game was far from over. In fact, I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.